Gwen John was born in 1876 in Wales. She attended the Slade Art School. She was one of the first generation of women artists who really got to benefit from the equal education offered by the Slade. At the beginning of the 20th century, she moved to Paris. This was after her graduation from the Slade. And originally she moved there with a group of her female friends, but she ended up returning by herself. And there she really forged her career as an artist and an artist model. And she remained there in Paris or in the outskirts of Paris the rest of her working life. This was an unprecedented time of freedom for middle-class women who were living independently or with their friends in rented accommodation in urban centres. So women were accepting places at university or accepting places at art school. They were taking on jobs as typists, secretaries, shop assistants, or like John, as artist models. And in accepting these positions, they were embracing a different kind of future. They weren't just treading water before marriage. They were seeking out personal, emotional, and intellectual freedoms and fulfillment. Sort of soon after John arrived in Paris, she began working as an artist model in order to make money, in order to kind of free up her days to paint. But while working as an artist model, she met the sculptor Rodin, who was incredibly successful and famous at this point. And she was very overwhelmed and impressed by him. And this began a love affair that would really dominate the next few years of her life. The focus on the relationship with Rodin, it makes sense because it has a culturally familiar shape. This is a story of a submissive, young, obsessive woman who falls for an older, talented, genius man who eventually tires of her and ends up with somebody else. And I think that this is a heteronormative trope. It's something that recurs and it sticks. You can see versions of this particular story played out across 19th and 20th century culture. But I think what this does is I think it misunderstands the most consistent, sustaining and meaningful intimacies in John's life, which were with women. Gwen John was bisexual. She had relationships with men and with women, but this term is obviously a relatively modern category, and it certainly isn't the way that I think John would have necessarily described herself. I think when we're thinking about artists like John, it's important to think about queer desire and queer identity in a more expansive way, to think about queerness as a set of experiences that includes but is not limited to sexual acts. When we talk about sexuality, we often use the term orientation, and I think this word is actually really useful when thinking about John, thinking about what was her life and her sense of self structured around. Where was the love, care, intimacy, romance, where was that directed to and oriented towards? And I think for the majority of her life, that was towards women. The women in John's life, they were friends, artists, collectors, patrons, fellow models, women that made her clothes. There's a whole network of women in Paris that John was interacting with and close to during the 1910s and 1920s. A few notable examples of those women. One of them was Mary Catherine Constance Lloyd, who was also an artist. She was John's one of her closest friends. They wrote to each other throughout their lives. She also had a very close relationship with the artist and artist model Dorelia McNeill, who would later go into a relationship with Gwen John's brother, the artist Augustus John. John's preoccupation with women, the kind of sustaining presence that women had in her life, is not only something you can see in her personal papers, in her letters, in her notebooks, but it's also something that feels to me incredibly obvious just in the clarity of focus of her work, which across her career, it was just all about women. She very rarely painted male sitters. The Convalescent is one of a number of works which are kind of small format, intimate, immediate works that are just portraits of women in her life. So all of Gwen's portraiture is of women, save for a series of drawings of military generals, and all of them are somewhat staid and formal. And there are a couple of drawings of the poet Arthur Symons. The drawings of men are otherwise forgettable, while the images of women are astonishing in their clarity of focus, in their tenderness, in their attention, and in their sheer bulk. So this painting is The Convalescent, and it was painted in the 1920s. It's one of a series of works that shows a woman reading. And these scenes draw from traditional representations of the Virgin Mary when she's informed by an angel that she's going to give birth to Christ. And these paintings are called Annunciation scenes. So while Mary turns from her book, John Sitter continues to read. The life of dutiful motherhood Mary's about to embark upon is not the lot of John Sitter. She can continue to seek out fulfillment and pleasure alone. Reproduction and family are not necessarily her future. And so I think when you're looking at these pictures by John, you have to think about the passionate interest that she cultivated in women, their habits, the way they move, how their thoughts emerge through subtle gestures in their bodies. And that feels to me very much what The Convalescent and all of her work is about. It's about this attention to and focus on the experiences, emotions, the inner lives of women.